Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you navigate the brutal reality of human interaction. You live in a world where every single day, someone will test your boundaries, challenge your decisions, and attempt to undermine the authority you've worked to establish. This isn't paranoia speaking. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about human nature that most people are too weak or too naive to acknowledge. Thomas Hobbes understood this centuries ago when he wrote that life in its natural state is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He wasn't being pessimistic. He was being realistic about what humans actually are beneath the thin veneer of civilization we've constructed around ourselves. When someone defies your authority, they're not just disagreeing with you or having a bad day. They're conducting a primal test, an ancient ritual that goes back to the very foundations of human society. They're asking a fundamental question. Are you truly the sovereign of your own domain, or are you just another pretender wearing a crown that doesn't belong to you? This moment of defiance is critical because how you respond will determine not just the outcome of this particular interaction, but the entire trajectory of your relationship with that person and everyone who witnesses what happens next. Authority, you see, is not something you're given by virtue of a title or position. It's something you must continuously earn, defend, and prove through your actions. The first thing you must understand is that authority without the willingness to enforce it is not authority at all. It's merely suggestion wrapped in formal language. Hobbes called this the sword of justice, the ultimate backing that gives weight to every law, every rule, every command. Without this sword, without the clear understanding that there are consequences for defiance, your authority becomes a joke, a performance that everyone can see through. But here's where most people make their critical error. They think the sword must always be drawn, that authority means constant aggression and dominance displays. This is the thinking of amateurs, of those who confuse power with brutality and mistake fear for respect. True authority, the kind that Hobbes wrote about when he described the Leviathan, operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It exists in the space between what is said and what is understood, between the explicit command and the implicit consequence. When someone defies you, they're essentially gambling with their position in the social hierarchy, betting that you lack either the will or the ability to respond effectively. Your response in this moment must be calculated, proportional, and absolutely decisive. It cannot be emotional, cannot be reactive, and it cannot be weak. The person testing you is not just an individual. They represent every future challenge to your authority, every potential rebellion that could destabilize the order you've worked to create. Consider the nature of the defiance itself. Is this someone who genuinely misunderstands the situation, who lacks information or context? Is this someone who's feeling overwhelmed or pressured and lashing out defensively? Or is this someone who has made a calculated decision to challenge your position, to see if they can climb over you on their way to greater power or freedom? Each of these scenarios requires a different response, but all of them require immediate attention. Ignoring defiance, hoping it will go away or resolve itself, is perhaps the worst possible strategy because it signals to everyone watching that your authority is optional, that your commands are suggestions rather than requirements. The brilliant insight that Hobbes provided, and one that most people completely miss, is that true sovereignty is not about controlling others. It's about controlling yourself so completely that others naturally align with your will. When you react emotionally to defiance, when you let anger or frustration drive your response, you're essentially abdicating your throne and descending to the level of those who challenge you. You're engaging in the kind of chaotic power struggle that characterizes what Hobbes called the state of nature, where might makes right and every interaction becomes a battle for dominance. This is exhausting, inefficient, and ultimately unsustainable. Instead, your response must come from a place of cold calculation, of clear understanding about what needs to happen and why. When someone defies your authority, you must first assess the threat they represent, not just to you personally, but to the entire system or organization you're responsible for leading. Are they challenging a specific decision, or are they challenging your right to make decisions at all? Are they doing this publicly or privately? Are they doing this in a way that encourages others to follow their example, or are they doing this in isolation? These factors determine the magnitude and nature of your response. If the defiance is minor, private, and appears to be based on genuine confusion or disagreement, your response can be corrective rather than punitive. You can reassert your position clearly, explain your reasoning if appropriate, and make it clear that while you're open to discussion, the final decision remains yours. This approach demonstrates confidence without brutality, authority without tyranny. It shows that you're secure enough in your position to engage with challenges constructively while maintaining absolute clarity about who ultimately holds the power to decide. But when the defiance is public, deliberate, and designed to undermine your authority in front of others, your response must be swift, unambiguous, and consequential. This is not the time for lengthy explanations or democratic deliberation. This is the time to demonstrate exactly what Hobbes meant when he wrote about the necessity of absolute sovereignty. The person who defies you publicly is not just challenging you. They're attempting to destroy the social contract that holds your organization or relationship together. They're essentially arguing that your authority is illegitimate and that others should feel free to ignore your commands. Your response in these moments must be immediate and decisive. You cannot allow time for others to rally around the defiant person or for doubt about your authority to spread. You must make it absolutely clear that defiance carries real costs, that challenging your authority is not a free action without consequences. This doesn't mean you should be cruel or vindictive, but it does mean that the consequences must be significant enough to deter future challenges while being fair enough to maintain your moral authority. The key insight here is understanding that authority is fundamentally about trust, not the warm, fuzzy kind of trust that comes from being liked, but the cold, hard trust that comes from being predictable and reliable in your responses to both cooperation and defiance. People need to know that when they follow your lead, they'll be rewarded or at least protected, and when they challenge your authority, they'll face consequences. This predictability is what allows organizations, relationships, and societies to function without constant chaos and conflict. Machiavelli understood this principle when he wrote that it's better to be feared than loved, but what most people miss is that he also wrote extensively about the importance of being respected. Fear alone creates resentment and rebellion. Love alone creates weakness and exploitation. But respect, earned through consistent, fair, and decisive action, creates the kind of voluntary compliance that makes true authority possible. When people respect your authority, they follow your lead, not because they're forced to, but because they understand that doing so serves their own interests, as well as the common good. This brings us to one of the most crucial aspects of handling defiance: understanding the audience. When someone challenges your authority, they're not just communicating with you. They're communicating with everyone who can see or hear the interaction. They're making a statement about their own power and position, and they're testing whether others will support them or support you. Your response, therefore, must be crafted not just for the person who defied you, but for everyone who's watching to see what happens next. If you respond too harshly to minor defiance, you risk appearing tyrannical and losing the moral authority that supports your practical authority. If you respond too weakly to serious defiance, you risk appearing ineffective and losing the practical authority that supports your moral authority. The balance between these extremes is where true leadership lives, and finding that balance requires understanding not just the immediate situation, but the broader context in which your authority operates. Consider what happens in the long term when you successfully navigate a challenge to your authority. The person who defied you learns that your authority is real and has consequences. The people who witnessed the interaction learn that your authority is not just a title or position, but something that you actively maintain and defend. Most importantly, you learn something about yourself, about your own capacity to remain calm under pressure, to make difficult decisions, and to maintain your position even when challenged. But there's something else that happens, something that Hobbes understood, but that many modern leaders miss entirely. When you handle defiance properly, firmly but fairly, decisively but not vindictively, you actually strengthen the social contract that binds your organization or relationship together. You demonstrate that the authority structure isn't arbitrary or capricious, but is based on clear principles and consistent application. This makes everyone feel more secure because they know what to expect and how to succeed within the system you've created. The person who initially defied you, if they're intelligent and reasonable, will often become one of your strongest supporters once they understand the boundaries and consequences. They tested your authority not because they wanted to destroy it, but because they needed to know if it was real. Once they discover that it is real, that it's backed by both the will and the ability to enforce consequences, they can relax into the structure you provide, rather than constantly testing and probing for weaknesses. This is why Hobbes argued that strong, clear authority is not the enemy of freedom, but its prerequisite. In a situation where authority is weak or unclear, everyone must constantly fight for their position, must constantly defend themselves against potential threats, must constantly negotiate and renegotiate the basic terms of their relationships. This is exhausting and ultimately destructive. But when authority is clear and reliable, when people understand the rules and know they'll be enforced fairly, they're free to focus their energy on productive activities rather than political maneuvering. Understanding this principle changes everything about how you approach defiance. Instead of seeing it as a personal attack or a threat to your ego, you begin to see it as an opportunity to strengthen the system you're responsible for leading. Each challenge to your authority that you handle well makes future challenges less likely and makes your organization more stable and productive. Each person who tests your boundaries and discovers that they're real becomes someone who can help you maintain those boundaries with others. But here's where the real sophistication comes in. Sometimes the best response to defiance is not immediate confrontation, but strategic patience. If someone challenges your authority in a minor way, or in a way that doesn't threaten the broader system, sometimes the most powerful response is to let them experience the natural consequences of their defiance, rather than imposing artificial ones. This requires tremendous confidence and self-control, but it can be incredibly effective because it demonstrates that your authority doesn't depend on constant enforcement. It's built into the structure of reality itself. For example, if someone defies your authority by refusing to follow a procedure or protocol, and that procedure exists for their own protection or benefit, sometimes the best response is to document their refusal and then let them experience the consequences when the procedure's importance becomes clear. This approach requires that you be genuinely confident in the wisdom of your decisions and genuinely unconcerned about short-term appearances of weakness. But when it works, it's devastatingly effective because the person learns not just that your authority is real, but that it's based on genuine understanding and competence rather than arbitrary power. The key is knowing when to use which approach, and this comes down to understanding the difference between defiance that threatens the system and defiance that threatens only the individual who's being defiant. System-threatening defiance must be addressed immediately and decisively. Individual-threatening defiance can sometimes be allowed to play out naturally, with you stepping in only to prevent serious harm or to clean up the consequences. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of maintaining authority, the absolute necessity of following through on whatever consequences you establish. Nothing destroys authority faster than making threats you're unwilling or unable to carry out. When you tell someone that defying your authority will result in specific consequences, those consequences must materialize exactly as promised. This is not about being vindictive or cruel. It's about being reliable and trustworthy in a way that makes future conflicts unnecessary. People need to know that your words mean exactly what they say, that your warnings are not bluffs, and that your promises, both positive and negative, will be kept. This predictability is what allows rational people to make good decisions about how to interact with you. When your responses to both cooperation and defiance are unclear or inconsistent, people have no choice but to test your boundaries constantly because they never know what to expect. The most successful leaders, the ones who maintain authority with minimal conflict and maximum voluntary compliance, are those who are absolutely reliable in their responses to different types of behavior. Their people know exactly what will happen if they cooperate and exactly what will happen if they don't. This knowledge makes the choice obvious for anyone who's thinking rationally about their own interests. But what about the people who aren't thinking rationally, who are driven by emotion or ego or some other factor that makes them resistant to logical consequences? These people present a special challenge because normal incentive structures don't work with them. They may continue to defy your authority even when doing so clearly works against their own interests. In these cases, your response must be calibrated not for them, because they're beyond rational influence, but for everyone else who's watching to see how you handle irrational defiance. Your response to irrational defiance must be swift, clear, and final. You cannot afford to engage in extended negotiations or attempts at persuasion with someone who's not operating rationally, because doing so signals to everyone else that irrational behavior is a viable strategy for getting your attention and potentially getting special treatment. Instead, you must make it clear that irrationality brings consequences just as surely as rational defiance does, and often more severe consequences because irrational behavior threatens not just the immediate situation, but the entire basis for reasonable discourse and cooperation. This is one of the hardest aspects of maintaining authority, because it requires you to act decisively against people who may genuinely need help rather than punishment. But you must remember that your first responsibility is to the system and the people who are operating rationally within it. You cannot sacrifice the stability and security of the many for the sake of accommodating the irrationality of the few. This doesn't mean you should be heartless or lack compassion, but it does mean that your compassion cannot come at the expense of your authority or the broader good you're responsible for protecting. The final aspect of handling defiance that you must understand is the importance of moving forward after the immediate crisis has been resolved. Once you've addressed the defiant behavior and its consequences have been applied, you must be prepared to work with that person going forward as if the incident never happened, provided they've accepted the consequences and are willing to operate within the established boundaries. Holding grudges or continuing to punish someone after they've learned their lesson is counterproductive because it creates resentment and makes future cooperation more difficult. The goal of addressing defiance is not revenge or domination. It's education and system maintenance. Once someone understands how the system works and their place within it, they should be welcomed back as a full participant. This requires tremendous emotional discipline on your part, because you must be able to separate your personal feelings about being challenged from your professional responsibility to maintain an effective organization or relationship. This ability to forgive and move forward after establishing consequences is actually one of the most powerful tools in your authority toolkit because it demonstrates that your authority is not personal or vindictive, but systematic and principled. People who see you handle defiance this way, firmly but fairly, with clear consequences followed by genuine forgiveness, understand that they're dealing with someone who's truly in control of themselves and their domain. The ultimate truth about authority that Hobbes understood, and that you must internalize if you want to be truly effective, is that it's not about controlling others. It's about creating conditions where others can make good decisions for themselves. When your authority is clear, consistent, and fair, when the consequences of both cooperation and defiance are predictable and proportional, rational people will choose cooperation because it serves their interests. Irrational people will reveal themselves through their choices and can be dealt with accordingly. Your authority, properly understood and properly exercised, becomes a service you provide to everyone in your sphere of influence. You create the structure and predictability that allows them to focus their energy on productive activities rather than constant political maneuvering. You shoulder the burden of making difficult decisions and enforcing unpopular but necessary consequences so that they don't have to live in chaos or uncertainty. This is why handling defiance properly is so crucial, not because your ego needs to be protected or your dominance needs to be established, but because the stability and productivity of everyone under your authority depends on your willingness to maintain the boundaries and consequences that make organized life possible. When you fail to address defiance, you're not just failing yourself, you're failing everyone who depends on the order and predictability you're responsible for maintaining. So when someone defies your authority, remember that this moment is not about you and them. It's about the system you've created and your responsibility to everyone within it. Your response must be measured not by how it makes you feel or how it affects your relationship with the defiant person, but by how it affects the overall health and functionality of the organization or relationship you're responsible for leading. This perspective transforms defiance from a personal attack into a professional challenge, from an emotional crisis into a strategic opportunity. The person who challenges your authority is ultimately giving you a gift, the chance to demonstrate the reality and reliability of the system you've created, the opportunity to strengthen the social contract that binds your organization together, and the occasion to prove to yourself and everyone else that you are truly worthy of the authority you hold. Handle this gift with the seriousness and sophistication it deserves, and you will find that your authority becomes stronger, more respected, and more effective with each challenge you successfully navigate.